Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here for our 5th meeting of the Pricing Options for Equitable Mobility Task Force. It's great to see and hear all of you, and I hope you're staying healthy and well. And once again, we just really thank you for your continued dedication to this work, despite the challenging circumstances that we're all in. I want to also start the meeting by saying an apology. We had some technical difficulties, which I feel just happen every day in this new reality. Our meetings will begin at 6 p.m. and we did update the calendar invite, but it looks like that didn't switch on everyone's calendar. So if you maybe use GCal and it didn't sync with our Outlook calendar, we'll try to send an updated meeting invite so that you know it starts at 6, since unfortunately we're not meeting in person and having dinner together beforehand. But apologies for those who did sign on at 5:30. We will promise to give you that half hour back in the day. All right, and thank you so much everyone for being here. If you are a task force member who have called in via phone, and if you could let us know that via text or email per the email we sent earlier, that'd be great, just so we can make sure that you can speak when we get to that part in the agenda. And we will begin the meeting, as we'll begin probably all of our meetings for the foreseeable future, with a little brief orientation to Zoom, the platform that we're going to be using for the foreseeable future. So just some general guidelines for the meeting as a reminder. When you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. We really want to save time for discussion and questions, so we're going to ask that you hold questions and comments for those designated discussion times so that we can really maximize those windows and keep the meeting moving. We would love you to raise your hand to get in the queue during those discussion times for providing comments. I do need to do a little tech check to make sure you guys have the raise hand feature. So because I can see Tony on my screen, Tony, can you let me know, do you have a raise your hand option? He does, and he raised his hand. Okay, if anyone does not have a raise your hand option and is a task force member, feel free to send us a chat and we can, we'll try to troubleshoot that for you or get a workaround. Another quick comment about the chat. We were really happy last time to see a lot of good dialogue happening in the chat. If at all possible this time, let's try to keep the chat open for troubleshooting messages, and also because we want everyone to be able to kind of hear the comments that come up. But we don't want to limit, the good collaboration and dialogue, and we do appreciate you guys engaging in all those ways. And just some reminders about the actual controls. So if you're joining by computer, the mute should be at the bottom of your screen, as should the hand raise button. If you're calling in by phone, I believe the instructions are *6 to unmute or mute yourself and *9 to raise your hand. If you try either of those and it doesn't work, again, let us know and we will add it to the things that we're going to troubleshoot for next time. So for tonight's agenda, we're going to do some welcome and housekeeping at the top. Then Shoshana is going to walk us through some updates, project updates, including kind of a recap of what we've heard and learned through our first 4 meetings together in this sort of phase 1 of this process. And then do a bit of a look ahead and show an updated and more detailed work plan for the coming months together. And we'll save some time in that space for questions and comments from the task force. Then the staff presentation tonight is going to have kind of 2 components. One is a bit of a snapshot of the overall transportation, how our transportation system is funded. And then it's been a few meetings since we've talked about actual pricing typologies. So we're going to reintroduce the 5 kind of broad categories of pricing that we're excited to dive into with you over the next few months. We'll save as much time as possible for good discussion around those typologies, and then wrap up and look ahead for next steps. Before I go any further, are there any comments on the meeting number 4 summary?
A couple of people are saying that they don't have, they're putting in the chat bar that they don't have access to the hand raising.
They don't have access to the hand raising function. Okay. I am going to look at just a couple things and see if I can fix that. And Mariana and Michael, I might ask that you also look for, I think it's Ashton and Sarah that I see, if there's anything we can do for them I am not seeing it on my end. Ashton and Sarah and anyone else who's having that, please use the chat as your raise hand function. So if you want to just say, I'm raising my hand, that'll be our cue to know that you need that access. Thanks for flagging that for me, Shoshana. And I'm sorry, guys, we don't really understand the mysteries of Zoom. So before we move on from this, meeting 4 summary, any questions, comments, or clarifications before calling that final? Going once, going twice. Not seeing any hands or comments. And it looks like Aaron Grimmer gets the VIP award. He found that if you check under participants, there should be the raise hand feature there, which worked for Sarah. So thank you very much for helping us out. Okay, and then the next kind of housekeeping at the top of the meeting is about public comment. So we received our first written public comment before the meeting, and big thank you to Doug Allen, who I see is on our attendee list tonight. That was distributed to you via email prior to the meeting. We accept comments via writing and really encourage comments from the public via writing during this time because of the technical challenges you've just witnessed. But if anyone on the call right now would like to provide a 2-minute public comment and you're an attendee, please feel free to raise your hand and we will attempt to unmute you so you can provide the verbal public comments. I'm just going to pause for a second to see if any of our attendees would like to make a verbal public comment. Mariana, I'm not seeing any on my end. Are you?
No, I don't see any hands raised either.
Okay.
And none in text.
Great. With that, we will continue on. And again, thank you, Doug, for providing your written comments, and task force members, that is in your email and also posted on the task force website. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Shoshana to take us through some project updates.
Thank you, Emma, and good evening to everyone. Thanks again for being here, and nice to see you virtually, or at least see a few of you on the side of my screen virtually. I was saying earlier, I'm still getting a little bit used to giving presentations from the corner of my bedroom here, so I'm out of the fray of the rest of my house. So just bear with the awkwardness a little bit in this presentation format. We have reached a sort of our first key milestone for this project. We're transitioning from the first phase, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the work plan in a couple of slides, where we were really talking about how we got here and talking a lot about what do we mean by equitable mobility. And we're starting to now dive in and talk about pricing and learn about some pricing strategies, and then use the equitable mobility framework to think about what may or may not work. Before we sort of do the transition that we're going to do during this meeting, we do want to just pause and sort of summarize a little bit of what we've heard over the last 4 meetings. In general, there's been a lot of recurring themes, as well as a little bit of specifically some clear things that we heard last time in the really rich discussion during our first attempt at a Zoom meeting. So the first thing that we want to, just acknowledge that we've heard in different ways over the last couple of meetings was some questions about the intersection of this work, this project, this pricing work, and all sorts of other strategies and projects going on in PBOT. And we're actually going to talk about that. We have a few slides, and we'll actually be following up with a little more information after the meeting as well. We've also heard a clear interest in the intersection of mobility with public health, with safety, with economic development, and more. And a really clear recurring theme, I think, in every meeting was just sort of the overall criticality of transit to our mobility system. And a lot of times that specifically free transit came up. So those were sort of some large overall themes. And then this sort of thinking about the conversation specifically last time, we heard a real interest in, what are we seeing from COVID and continuing to learn about that, as well as an interest in continuing to move this conversation forward. And again, a number of key themes, which really had one of the interesting things I think we felt from the meeting was that The themes were the same themes we had been exploring through the equimobility framework, but the current situation is really sort of raising up the importance of all of them and of thinking robustly, and it's really exposing many of the inequities that we've already been seeing. So again, the essential nature of public transit, connection between transportation demand, jobs, and infrastructure, the idea that public space is contested space and experienced differently by different people, and that's especially important as we're also now seeing more people walking, biking, and it's just really apparent the connections to health and the use of the right-of-way, as well as something that had come up in a number of meetings about the importance of not just reliable and affordable transportation options, but really high quality and specifically clean, and the clear connections to public health of our different mobility options. We also heard last time about this sort of the power of collective action and creative thinking, and really the need for inclusive and equitable crisis response and prioritizing those most vulnerable. So those were the things that we felt, again, sort of popped out last time, as well as we've heard a lot over and over from you, and we will continue to think about those as we now transition to some specific strategies. So again, before we dive into the specific content, again, we want to do just a little bit more sort of grounding and respond to that first point around the group's charge and how it really intersects with other projects and processes. So we pulled out sort of a reminder of the task force charge as written in our charter, and it's specifically to inform PBOT and BPS as they consider if and how new pricing strategies could potentially be used more intentionally to improve mobility, address the climate crisis, and advance equity. And there's a couple of keywords that are highlighted there. And just to sort of really go over what they mean, we really want to be super clear. There's no decisions that have been made yet. There's a whole pricing continuum, and we do think that the research to date shows that pricing has some promise to advance climate outcomes and equimobility, but this is the question before all of us and what we want to explore over the next couple months or year. How Bureau leadership is looking to this group for advisory recommendations on how the city should implement or further explore new pricing options if we do think they could help to advance equitable mobility. And importantly, this task force is charged with looking at new ideas. We do have a different committee for PBOT, the Bureau Budget Advisory Committee, which is charged with advising on more existing revenues and budget considerations. So while there's sort of some overlap with some ongoing transportation funding things that we'll talk about, this committee is really sort of forward-looking around new strategies. This very colorful slide, we also want to use to talk about sort of another way for us to consider the intersection of this project with others, and we're referring to this as sort of our wheel of equitable mobility. And really this is meant to show that there's no one single transportation strategy that we think we can implement to create a more equitable and more sustainable system. Rather, there's many intersecting strategies, and they're visualized here as sort of connected gears in our wheel. And starting on the upper right, if we were to go clockwise, I guess, you can see that the overarching buckets are, there's an allocation of the space in our right of way, or sort of more simply, how we use our space in our streets. And do we use the space for do we allocate more space for cars or for pedestrians or for transit? And there's a set of strategies there. There's the need for safe and accessible infrastructure. And of course, we need to continue to build and maintain safe and accessible infrastructure, like sidewalks, like bike lanes, like paving our streets, and keeping the street infrastructure. Then there's a set of strategies around mobility services and options. And again, we've talked a lot about transit and the need to have a really quality, good transit service. We also are continuing to think about the role of other mobility services and options like bike share and like TNCs and even e-scooters and things like that. Another piece of the overall transportation is the use of incentives and programs. For instance, PWAT's Safe Routes to School program both works on having safe infrastructure around schools and also working in schools on educational programs so that kids understand how to use the infrastructure and get to school safely. And other examples of programs are our Sunday Parkway programs. And we have incentive programs where we actually give discounts to make different options more affordable. And then finally, the last sort of bucket strategy that we've been thinking about is the way that we price the system and reinvest the money that we gain from the pricing. And that, of course, is the specific charge that this task force is charged with discussing. And while this is our charge and to consider if and how to use pricing strategies more intentionally, we do know we can't consider this in a vacuum. This graphic is meant to show that they're all interconnected and complementary strategies. So we have to think about them all together. And then you'll also see in the back we have all of the sort of the things that we listed that we cared about. Sometimes we think of them as indicators that we discussed in the Equitable Mobility Framework are sort of scattered around the slide. And with each of these strategies, really, thanks to the feedback from you all, we have a set of tools and a set of sort of things to evaluate as we design any projects and programs across these strategies to think about how are they moving the dial, hopefully for the better along these things that we care about around climate and air quality and jobs and things like that. So this is meant to show sort of our large group of strategies that we can use here. And I think next slide. While that sort of speaks to the interconnectedness of them, we also do want to touch a little bit again on why is that green one there? Why is the pricing bucket there at all? And in the very first meeting, we talked about this and sort of gave most of the slideshow at the beginning was setting up why we think this is important, but we feel like it's worth sort of coming back and sharing a few of the highlights about from PBOT and BPS's perspective, and what City Council asked us to consider is that the reason we think we need to hone in on that green sort of strategy around pricing options is that the status quo is really inequitable, and the fact is that it's actually trending in the wrong direction. It's not like we're looking at a sort of a perfect system and then think about, oh, how can we charge more in one place and that will have some disproportionate benefits and burdens, but instead we're looking at a system where that we do already charge in certain places, and we do also have lots of places where we don't charge, and even in many of the prices where we are charging, we're not capturing all of the costs. So the question here is, are there ways that we can actually send different price signals that, even though it's sort of counterintuitive, might actually be more equitable and more sustainable from the status quo that we have? And from our perspective, there's enough evidence that that's a question worth digging into, that we think, so that's the discussion we want to have here with you all. But again, back to that other slide, is still an if. It's not been decided, but that is our sort of our starting point, that there's questions there we want to have. And I think I sort of said the second bullet worth. And then I think the other, the last point here is that also to do many of those other complementary strategies, we're operating in a system that is a really confined funding environment. And many of the other strategies that we might think are fabulous and maybe we want to turn up the dial on some of those, frankly, they also just need money. And maybe there are ways that we can sort of pair new pricing and new price signals and values of certain pieces of the system, gather some money and pour them into other areas. So that's, I think those are the sort of our answer to the interconnectedness and the charge. And so then, it has been a while since we've actually said what we mean when we talk about pricing. And in a few minutes, Emma's actually going to spend a little bit more time. We're still not going to go really deep, but it's going to talk about these a little bit more. But just to sort of ground us very quickly, we're talking about things like various types of parking prices. We're talking about various sort of commercial motor vehicle fleets or right-of-way access charges. There are tolls on highways and how we could use those variably, again, to manage demand. longer term things like potentially road usage charges where you charge by the vehicle miles traveled. And then again, in the longer term, something like a cordon or a congestion zone where you would put a circle around an area and charge to drive in. Is sort of the spectrum of things that we're actually talking about here. And again, we'll start to spend much more time on each of them as we move forward. And then sort of crucially, the other side of the coin that we want to explore with you all are what are the types of investments that we would want any potential new pricing strategy to support and revenues to support. We know we want to explore transit and infrastructure investments, as well as potentially rebates, subsidies, other incentives. And other ideas that we, as we get started and actually dig into things, we think there are likely other things that may come out of our discussions. So with all of that in mind, we wanted to show a slightly revised. The truth is we're pretty close to our original plan, but just sort of continue to fine tune. Again, we feel like we're wrapping up phase one, where we did discuss how we got to the place we are and what does equitable mobility mean. Tonight, we're diving in a really quick snapshot on transportation funding and just touching on what are the actual tools that we're talking about. As well, we want to sort of acknowledge that both a little bit tonight and just moving forward, we're going to continue to both evaluate and hope to talk to you and learn from you about what are the impacts of this current situation. And then we'll move into phases 3 and 4, where we'll really go more slowly than we're even going to have time to tonight to talk about a number of different strategies. And we've sort of bucketed them. Phase 3, we think we'll spend some time around parking and different types of parking pricing, around fleet and right-of-way access. And these are strategies that I think are more sort of city, we can implement as a city ourselves, if that makes sense. And then we also want to talk a little bit more about tolling in this first bucket. That, of course, is not City of Portland only. ODOT is driving the conversations around tolling and owns the facilities where we would toll. That said, that conversation is moving forward. So we do want to spend some time with you all just talking about it at a high level and sort of get your feedback on how we should continue to engage with ODOT in their conversations. So those are the first bucket that we'll explore, and then move to sort of a longer term phase and have conversations around cordons and potentially road user charges, or things that I think are both more regional. The City of Portland can't really move alone, and also likely considerably longer term strategies. And within each of these phases, as we sort of think about what we'll move through, we'll sort of spend some time really introducing what are the suite of strategies, what are we talking about, reviewing new ideas, thinking about lessons from other cities, and hopefully doing some brainstorming with all of you. And then we'll want to evaluate different strategies and different scenarios using the framework that we just developed, and sort of ask ourselves questions around each of those things that we care about, and see if it feels like some of these strategies may be able to help us move the bar in some of those areas. So we'll have some discussion like that. We'll also be using some technical tools. We have our consultant, WSP, which is going to help us do some sort of early stage modeling, and hopefully help us do some more research to sort of think about, as we start to think that some tools may or may not show promise, what does the research and what does the modeling even just begin to show the impact of some of them may be. And then finally, again, with anything that starts to show promise, we'll want to talk about what are the complementary strategies, or what are the conditions we'd want to put on them. And especially for the longer term strategies, how would, what are the conditions of readiness we think we might need if we were to, recommend something like a cordon many years out? What would the level of transit need to be, or something like that? And again, nothing is, all things open just for consideration. And then finally, phase 5, which I can't see in my screen because I just see your faces. But I think that phase 5 is sort of, we would bring it all together, develop some recommendations, and prepare some sort of a report, again, for the directors of BPS and PBOT. And the last thing, I guess, is, that's the plan. Again, we feel like we're relatively on track from where we had hoped to be, but we also know we want to remain sort of. We always knew we had to be flexible with this project that is bringing lots of things together. We want to remain even more flexible than usual. Again, things are we're in a very unprecedented time. I'm doing a presentation from my bedroom, so things will continue to change, and our transportation system is, we know is changing. We know our community needs are changing, and we want to be really attuned to what's going on outside, and what are the needs of the community and what are the needs of the transportation system. So hope to sort of strike that balance between moving through some things with a plan and being nimble and open to near-term opportunities as they seem like we should address them. So I think that's a number of slides for me, and just wanted to pause there before moving on.
Yeah, thanks, Shoshana. So we know that was a lot of information, and as Shoshana referenced, we have some parking lot questions that have come up in previous meetings that we haven't had time to kind of formally address. We hope that some of the information just shared helps address it, but we'll follow up with some written responses as well. But we do want to pause here for a few minutes and invite any kind of questions or comments on that work plan look ahead and the recap of sort of what we've heard through this first phase of work. So if you'd like to use your raise your hand function, task force members, if there's any comments you'd like to contribute, we would love to hear them.
We have a hand raised from an attendee. Just want to acknowledge that.
Great. I'm gonna give precedent to our task force members. Because of our limited time in our meetings, we tend to provide attendee opportunities for comment during the public comment opportunity. But we'll see how time is going with our panelist discussion. Are there any panelists with their hands raised, Mariana?
Yes, we have Andy going first.
Andy, we'd love to hear your comments or questions.
Thank you. Under your slide, why is the City of Portland initiating this project? Your first bullet is our mobility status quo is inequitable and trending worse. I know we had a full meeting that was a workshop on that subject, but I'm wondering, that was a brainstorming. Is there some sort of systematic delineation of what are the inequities? What's the measure of inequity? What data is showing that it's trending worse? And will it serve as a means of evaluating whatever other options we might be interested in to test those options on whether or not they trend the opposite direction or continue trending worse?
Super question. Well, so we had, we've sort of touched on this in a number of meetings. We had the sort of the brainstorm discussion after the history meeting. We also, in the very first presentation, had some initial data that we showed, there's evidence of the inequities and things like disproportionate commute times that we see across communities of color, differences in affordability of transportation options. We have sort of a suite of indicators that we've started with. There's also just in things like, we know that the investments that have historically been made that have disrupted and dismantled and destroyed communities, and then different communities, instead of things like highways tearing through neighborhoods, have obviously had disproportionate and inequitable outcomes. So there's some data in what we see right now on how people are moving around the city. There's, even when we think about the equitable mobility indicator, even data in inequities and health outcomes, things like that. So there's sort of a whole suite of things where we feel like we see inequities, and we do see that there's many places where those are continuing to get worse. We see inequities geographically in safety data, things like that. So I think we have a starter list of things, and many of those are tied to those equitable mobility indicator, or the list of things. We also know, as we continue to do this work, we want to have a much more robust understanding of that. And then exactly so that we can continue, we can say, okay, here are the places where we have, concerns, and how can we move the dial and start to make them better. So it's sort of, yes, we're starting and we have work to do.
And the one thing I'd add, Andy, going back to our work plan slide, which I'm not able to go back to right now, but when we are in that phase 3 and 4 that Shoshana was mentioning, we will, utilizing our framework, bring in analysis wherever possible and however possible to speak to those indicators. Being perfectly honest, we have a suite of really rich indicators, and not all of them will we be able to get a specific data point on, but we will endeavor to use case studies from other cities, use qualitative discussion around our table, and also lean on our technical experts, both in-house and with our consultant, to answer those questions. So across that whole spectrum, our plan is to use that as an evaluative framework against the status quo as we start to explore specific strategies. Mariana, do we have another hand?
Yeah, we have Bao next.
Great. That was Bao, you said?
That's correct.
Bao, can you hear us?
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, I'm too excited, I guess, for Monday meeting. Let's see. I have 2 questions or / comments. So first question is related to the budget forecast. I just saw the news today or yesterday, the governor forecast there will be close to 3 billion or 2.7 billion budget shortfall. I know some other city also experiencing, lost revenue, tax revenue due to the COVID. So my question is, there was slides under about types of investments and strategies. I'm wondering how this, budget shortfall, both near term, long term could affect, what subsidies, incentives the city or the state can provide for people to shift modes, right? So because that's a very important piece. My second question is, I would like to either, I wonder if the PVOD or this task force could consider how, the changing nature already of the teleworking could change, impact the demand for trips, because many of the things I've been reading news, like from Wall Street Journal or other news, that say this might stay the current pattern even we go back to post-COVID. So that's a big probably. Of course, we don't know the magnitude of change, but we know that would be probably significant change the demand side of that. So in light of this change, how we can adjust maybe how that might inform our pricing conversation, because the demand fundamentally changed. So 2 questions.
Great, thank you so much. Good questions. So to the first one around funding, we actually in a minute are going to spend just a couple more minutes on sort of setting the funding background, because it is a really relevant sort of jumping off point as we talk about pricing. And yes, there are all sorts of new funding challenges because of COVID-19. The truth is that the state of transportation funding, even without COVID-19, has been pretty tenuous for a long time. So I think as we'll talk about, the charge of this group is really more to think about how does pricing change outcomes and more fully account for impacts. It is interconnected with how do we fund the transportation system, because the revenue we raise right now, goes a lot to basic maintenance, and as things get tighter, yes, it will make it harder to sort of do. If we have to choose between filling potholes and giving people transit passes, they're both important. So it's a important context that we need to think about and understand in this conversation. And I guess I don't have a good answer, to how we fix it, but it is definitely part of the information we'll have to keep in mind as we move forward. And again, we had challenges already, and those challenges are becoming much more pronounced right now. And then to your second question, I think, more broadly, we are really trying to understand, again, all of the things that are changing right now, and teleworking is certainly one of them. The long-term outcome, right now is fairly speculatory. Lots of people will probably keep speculatory. I don't know if that's a word, but lots of people will probably keep, teleworking for a while. On the other hand, people may be more inclined to jump in their cars and not take transit because they have health concerns. So I think that will be part of our job, to sort of think about, to try to anticipate the changes, and then think about what are the best complementary strategies that we should recommend if we're going to start to get into the pricing space, and maybe, taking advantage of the opportunities for increased teleworking is something that we would definitely want to keep in mind in this moment. But again, sort of don't exactly have an answer other than, you're right, something that we have to sort of take into account right now.
Mm-hmm. Great questions. And on the telework side, it was, if you track kind of mode split data, teleworking was already growing. And I think you're right, that they'll just see an exponential increase now. And PBOT in different spheres and different spaces is definitely looking into that questions, but we'll work to kind of bring the lessons from that work in to inform our conversations here as a task force. Mariana, any other hands raised?
No other hands raised right now.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. If you do have further thoughts or questions about the work plan or any of the information shown, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. As I said, we'll follow up again also with some written responses to some of those parking lot questions from previous meetings. So let's keep this train moving to the next presentation, which again, we'll start with Shoshana, which is a snapshot of transportation funding, and a great segue, Bao, thanks so much for your question. So Shoshana, over to you.
Yeah, so, and again, just a really quick overview here before I turn it over to Emma, who will actually sort of get into some of the pricing conversations. But we do think this is important context. So at the highest level, currently, when PBOT looks at our transportation funding revenue buckets, there's a few buckets. We have local taxes, the local gas tax, local heavy vehicle revenue. We have a number of fees, licenses, permits, development charges, fees, charges around parking. We have another bucket sort of thought of broadly as intergovernmental funding, and that actually brings in what is sort of called our state highway fund transfer, which is really the state level gas tax and state vehicle registration fees and DMV fees and things like that, as well as grants that we get for specific projects. And those are restricted specifically to the projects that we're getting a grant for, sort of obviously. And then there's a number of pretty small but sort of miscellaneous things. One example is we do get sometimes some general fund transfers for things like there's the capital set aside program, which is largely about maintenance projects. But there's a number of sort of smaller things. None of them are very big. But and again, many of those buckets are actually pretty restricted. We charge a fee for a specific thing, and we have to use it for that specific thing. We do, we get some revenue from other bureaus to do work that they're paying us to do with sewers and things like that. But those are the highest level sort of buckets of our transportation funding. And as we have talked about a little bit already tonight and in previous meetings, there's a lot of, our system has a lot of challenges the way it is right now. Many of those sources are regressive. They're also tied to the things that are sort of counter to our goals. Or, when people use more gasoline or drive more, we get more money. So if we need money, we're looking to people to do the things that, again, are counter to our larger transportation system goals. Those revenue systems also, a lot of them really don't capture the true cost of negative impacts of the thing that they're charging for. And they really don't do much to manage demand. Instead, the system perpetuates carbon emissions and the inequities that we see today. There's some other challenges, simply car infrastructure that we, you know, as a state and a country build a lot of is pretty expensive. And we can't keep up again, even with the basic maintenance. And not only sort of is it expensive to keep up with what we have, but costs are actually increasing while revenues are decreasing. And I think the next slide shows that a little bit more. Right, this decreasing revenues while we have increasing competition. Our transportation system funding systems are on the decline. They're not keeping up with inflation. Vehicles are becoming more fuel efficient, which is something that we really want, yet it brings us less revenue. At the same time, there's simply increased demands with increased population and increased development, as well as all sorts of new users of our transportation system. We have transportation network companies. We have all sorts of new delivery forms. So we've got sort of a clear mismatch between the funding decline and the use and the competition for our right of way, and sort of all the things we need to fund and keep up with increasing. And I think the next one. So with all this funding, what is it really designed to do? What do the existing transportation fees, prices, and funds do? Much of the revenue that we do gather is really designed to cover the basic costs of operating the system, basic maintenance and operations. And again, it's not even actually doing that very well. We have really severe shortages in even just things like basic maintenance. Again, we do get some other funding for specific projects, things like grants to build specific safety projects, other projects, and this is restricted funding. And then we do receive some funding for particular services that we provide. I guess I mentioned that already. And as well as some funding, things like system development charges that we get when developers are building things. And those are tied a little bit to the impact that a particular development is supposed to have on a system. So it accounts for the impact in some ways, as well as parking fees, which are designed to help meet a number of different policy goals. That said, sort of looking across the sort of three things that revenue can do and sort of just cover costs and pay for upkeep, capture sort of the true costs and negative externalities, and the third sort of green bucket of managing demand and sort of affecting outcomes. We don't really consistently do those two other things super well. We don't have a consistent process for trying to capture the true negative externalities or just the true externalities of particular transportation choices, and nor do we really robustly use price signals to manage demand and impact outcomes. And so these latter two buckets are really the two areas where the focus of this group lies. You know, we're not here. We have transportation funding challenges, but our task is not to think about how do we just pay for the system. We're here to think about how do we use pricing to create a better system, a more equitable system, a more sustainable system. But sort of to Bao's question, we can't entirely separate those two pieces, and just need to keep in mind some of the background realities. So I guess this, back to our charge, the task force is set up to advise on if and how new pricing strategies can improve the inequities of the status quo and climate outcomes. And in looking forward at new strategies, we'll need to acknowledge the many purposes of prices in our system, including covering costs of maintenance and operations, as well as capturing true costs and affecting outcomes. And I think that's, again, sort of a very quick background, but we just, as we start to talk about prices and fees, feel like it really is important to have at least a little bit of that sort of higher level grounding in all of the uses of revenue and ways that we think about fees so far. And with that, I will turn it over to Emma, who's going to actually start to talk about some pricing policies.
Yes, I will. We are doing very well on agenda. So I do want to just pause for a beat and see if there are any questions on those slides before we dive in. I did see Stephanie's hand pop up, and Mariana, if you can keep an eye on any others. But Stephanie, would you like to ask a question?
I would, please. And hello, everybody. As we discuss pricing, implicitly, we're going to assume that imposing a new pricing scheme or schemes will cause changes in the way demand occurs. And so are we going to also be suggesting infrastructure possibilities, or are we going to be aiming at certain urban planning goals? And for example, suppose the city has in mind that we want a car-free center city. So to do that, you have to make it really expensive to get into the center city. And we'll not talk about the inequity part just at this moment. But so then that implies, though, maybe a regional system of dedicated bus lanes with park and rides way out in Hillsborough and, you know, out in, I don't know, wherever, we'll say McMinnville or whatever, to make it all work. I mean, if we're going to make it so difficult to get into the center city in a car, we have to have another way to get workers in. And so will we be thinking about urban planning goals, I guess is my question? Not only pricing, but what has to change in order to make the pricing effects work? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question. And I think, you know, broadly speaking, the answer is yes. I think, you know, especially for some big move like you're talking about in the central city, you know, that's sort of exactly what when we use the term conditions of readiness in one of the slides, that's sort of what we're trying to get at. We wouldn't be able to do anything that, you know, makes it super expensive and you know, is that restrictive unless people have really great alternatives, unless we know that there's other ways that people can get downtown that are equitable and accessible and safe and all of those things, because otherwise we would just have a quiet downtown and it would be, you know, it wouldn't achieve our goals. So yes, we have to think about, I think, both the other sort of, again, what we've been thinking about as complementary transportation strategies, as well as a really good question. Some of them are complementary land use strategies, or, you know, or other pieces of the connections between jobs and housing and things like that. So absolutely, yeah, that wheel is sort of meant to sort of put pricing in within the context of all of the other things. And again, it feels like in some ways, it's one of the pieces we haven't thought about as much, which is why we want to have this conversation. But we also know we can't have it by itself.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And Stephanie, I think, you know, the if and the how piece of the charge, that how is where it's a loaded word, but it's kind of where we tried to capture the not just should we or shouldn't we explore or implement a pricing strategy, but how would we have to do it? And that.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. I feel like I'm a little slow to pick up on that, but in any case, I wanted to articulate these thoughts. So, okay, thank you very much.
And not at all. There's a reason we feel that there's a reason we have a charge, and the reason that we flash the charge up in most meetings, because this stuff is confusing. So, thank you so much for the question. Mariana, are there any other hands raised?
No other hands raised at this time.
Okay, then we will continue on. And this is great because we're going to, I think, maximize some good time for discussion afterwards. So I'm really excited to present what I'm calling the teaser trailer. So as Shoshana said, you know, we haven't actually talked about specific pricing typologies or strategies since our very first meeting. But now that we are kind of transitioning from that phase one of our work to the future phases, we're ready to kind of dive back in. And as our work plan suggests, we're going to have a lot of time to dive really deep on those 5 different buckets. And I am definitely not an expert in all of these areas. You will hear from experts in these areas as we go. But what we wanted to do tonight was kind of give a refresher course on what we're trying to cover over the next, I guess, 12 months together. And so I'm going to kind of run through a bunch of these typologies, tell you where applicable, what the state of that pricing typology is in Portland today, and then look ahead at kind of what types of new strategies in that space this group could consider. And so as we go, what I'd like to encourage you to do is write down or think in your head just kind of what's grabbing your attention. We're not going to cover all the details. We're not going to go into the weeds. So really it's kind of what's piquing your interest, or what kind of tidbits are things you'd like to go back to explore when we have those deeper dives. And also what questions are coming up for you. I feel like we've all been really steeped in this rich conversation around equitable mobility and the different facets of our framework. So looking through that lens, and we're going to have a chance to do that in a much more robust way in future meetings, but what are those kinds of questions or areas of interest where you'd like to go deeper? What are those? And we'll have time afterwards to capture that feedback from you, which will really help us inform how we plan the future sessions. So let's start with typology number 1, which is one that we're all very familiar with, is parking. So we're going to start with a brief snapshot of parking in our city today. So PBOT charges for parking on street in different areas in the city. We have 5 different parking meter districts and 18 different parking permit districts. And outside of these areas, street parking is usually free. So a fun fact from our parking team, outside of those meter districts and permit districts, there's about 11.4 million linear feet of parking outside of those areas on our streets. So parking is a huge part of our transportation system. The city also operates 5 off-street parking garages in the downtown area through our Smart Park program, and those combined include about 4,000 spaces. And the prices in both those on-street and off-street spaces, the city-owned parking, the prices are fixed, meaning that they don't vary during the day when parking is enforced. There are hours when parking is not, and then it is free. But during those parking hours, the rates don't change. The rates on our parking meters were last updated about 4 years ago, and the city updated the Smart Park daily rates last November. And so parking prices have historically been set to optimize occupancy, which means how many spaces are available per block, and using the data and rises in just cost of living to kind of set those prices. And then in 2018, the city adopted what's called a performance-based parking strategy. Some of your fellow task force members were involved in that work. And that, when implemented, will lead to annual rate adjustments based on demand. So there is, as part of that adoption, there was an adoption of the performance-based parking manual, which we can provide as some pre-reading before our parking meeting, because it includes kind of the goals of that system and how it will be implemented. But it includes also a framework for how we'll use data to understand demand and update parking rates based on that. And then in addition to city-owned parking, there is, of no surprise, I'm sure, a lot of unpriced private parking in the city of Portland. In fact, a 2014 study estimated that there are 177,000 about free non-residential parking spaces in the city. And businesses through tax code get tax breaks or tax refunds for providing parking. And this used to be both for provision of parking for customers and employees. The employee rebate was removed from or by tax reform in 2018. So that's kind of what we do today. So what is on the table for us to consider going forward? And I want to mention that, you know, we are not being exhaustive in these lists. These are things that we know have some interest among the task force. Maybe we've talked about them before, or they're ideas that our internal technical experts have brought to our attention. But we do encourage you, if you have a strategy in any of these typologies that you'd like to see us put on the table, please do let us know when we discuss or after the meeting so we can add that in. But there are really, you know, dozens of interesting and innovative strategies that cities have explored or have implemented to around parking to manage demand or accomplish other goals. On the public parking side, a couple of those included that this group could consider would be just simply changes to the rates that we charge in our meters or our permit districts that are already established. Another thing we could look at in the existing meter districts is a change to the schedules of when parking is priced. So for example, our Smart Park garages, usually the max at 4 hours or more, you pay the same price. We could explore whether adding more rates or more rungs on that pricing ladder, what that does against our equitable mobility indicators. The task force could also consider weighing in about creating more areas in the city where public parking should be priced through new districts or new permit areas. And finally, while the city is poised to implement performance-based parking, as I mentioned, this group could also look into whether more dynamic, demand-based on-street parking pricing could help advance equitable mobility. And what that means is something that doesn't take a year to update, but actually fluctuates potentially in real time or by the hour, or just more frequently than annually based on demand. San Francisco is really a leader in the US in that dynamic style of parking management. And on the private side, things that this group could consider are implementing fees or taxes on unpriced private parking, unbundling. So that is when through regulation or other means, the city could encourage or require the decoupling of the price of real estate, so say rent or property purchase, from parking, which allows the kind of true cost of that parking space to have a price associated with it. And then as we discussed at our last meeting, there's a strategy called parking cash out. Washington, D.C. was in the news recently for just passing a parking cash out requirement. So this requires employers to provide their employees an option to get the value of the parking that they would be provided for free or for subsidy back, so that they can use that for other multimodal options as they wish. So again, this list isn't exhaustive. Mark down kind of what's seeming interesting to you or what questions you have. And if you have any other ideas we can put on the table, we'd love to hear that as well. So moving along to our second typology, which is a bit broad. It includes prices or fees on commercial motor vehicle fleets and other companies that access our right-of-way to conduct business. So what's the state of that today in Portland? Today, the city charges a 50-cent surcharge on all Uber and Lyft rides that originate within the city of Portland limits. And for taxi companies and other private for hire companies, PBOT charges a permit fee per vehicle. The surcharge and permit fees fund a variety of programs related to TNCs and other things, including vehicle safety inspections and driver background checks. The PDX Wave program, you can see their icon down there on the screen, which is about connecting Portlanders with wheelchair accessible rides on demand. Driver education and training, the Safe Ride Home program. So there's a lot of kind of using that fee to reinvest in other things happening already. We also charge parking fees for curb space for different car share companies, Zipcar being one of them, and then Car2Go before Car2Go left the Portland market. But currently, some things we don't charge for are there are no charges for the on-demand delivery or freight movement. And as Shoshana was saying with that graph, where we're seeing huge growing competing demands for our right-of-way space, that is a massive space where we are seeing a big uptick in use. A lot of that is frankly anecdotal. It's really hard to get the data on that, but that's something that we know is a topic of interest. We also currently do not charge for freight pickup drop-off zones, hotel zones, so these kind of the use of our curb for specific purposes. And so what, on the flip side, could this group consider to kind of look at as some new ideas and that we could chew on? The first is changes to that existing private for hire fee structure. So that could look like changing the fees based on occupancy. So maybe charging a lower fee or something for a high occupancy trip. It could be changes based on fuel type, so kind of incentivizing the use of electric vehicles or cleaner fuel trips or other things. We can also look at varying charges based on time of day, geography, or demand. Other cities that are doing this include Chicago, that has different zones now and different charges based on time of day, as well as based on occupancy. We can also consider and explore implementing fees and permit requirements for delivery companies. As I mentioned, it's hard to get data, and there are several hoops to jump through, for lack of better words, for looking at things like that. But a couple cities that are making moves there, New York is considering a permit requirement system for delivery companies. No decisions have been made yet, but that's happening through New York City Council. And you'll see the little little article there on the bottom right about the mayor of Paris has been very out front in saying this is an area she would like to tackle. And then we can also explore other fees around curb access tied to demand and use. All right, we're moving along. So the next bucket, as we kind of move along our spectrum from Portland implementing pricing to things that now would require more regional coordination and perhaps be on a longer term scale, but as you know, this is very much in the current discourse due to ODOT's project, is variable tolls. So what are variable tolls? We don't have them right now in our region, so I can't tell you the current state of tolls in Oregon, but they are a fee or a price charged for driving on a stretch of roadway. So that can either be the entire roadway or the entire facility is priced, or it can be just one lane. And those are often called express toll lanes or hot lanes, high occupancy toll lanes, where if you are a high occupancy vehicle, so more than 2 people, you can use that lane for free and transit uses it for free. But if you are a single occupancy driver, you can pay to use that express lane. In what's unique about variable tolls versus just kind of tolls to recoup costs for construction are they fluctuate based on demand. And they do that, the kind of newfangled tolling technology involves license plate recognition or transponders. So while, if you've driven over the Bridge of the Gods, you slow down, you pay at a toll booth, the variable rate toll systems that we see in the US and around the world no longer use that. It's all kind of digitized. And toll exemptions, different cities and different jurisdictions implement them in different ways, but you can design your system to provide exemptions or rebates for different kinds of trips, again, about kind of what you want to incentivize or disincentivize. So that could be around high occupancy vehicles, vehicle type, etc. So moving further along the spectrum, we'll talk about cordons and congestion zones. So what are they? This is, again, a kind of a broad term. There's a lot of different designs that fit in this bucket, and we see most of the examples of cordons and congestion zones coming out of Europe, a few in Asia. But basically, it's a variable or fixed charge to drive within or into a congested area. They're implemented by placing tolls on multiple existing entry points. So you think of a cordon as a big ring, but the actual place where you're charged is on the roadways that come into that ring. Some systems charge just when you cross the boundary, but others charge for driving within the boundary. So if you're someone who lives in that area and own a car, you get charged. And many schemes with cordons and congestion zones do provide discounts or exemptions, again, for types of trips. So based on, again, fuel, cleanliness, multi-passenger, high occupancy trips. 2 very famous examples that I think we did touch on very briefly at our first meeting were London's congestion zone, which I believe is the little top, very hard to see image on the slide there. But that was implemented, I believe, about 20 years ago, and dramatically reduced demand for driving into. It's a fixed charge to drive into that area of central London. But most recently, they, within the same boundary, implemented an ultra low emission zone. So now it's, if you are driving a dirty vehicle within or into the zone, you pay an additional charge on top of the congestion charge. Stockholm is another example of a city that has a congestion zone or a cordon. Theirs, I believe, is variable priced. We'll talk more about case studies in the future, but those 2 provide a bit of a study in comparatives and contrasts. I think the commonality in both of them was they were incredibly politically difficult to implement, and but now public opinion of them is quite positive once they were implemented, and both really did reduce congestion. And our final typology is road usage charges. So this can also be called VMT pricing or vehicle miles traveled pricing or pay as you drive. And that involves putting technology in someone's vehicle to track the miles they travel and charge the driver a fee based on use. And this is often seen as a really attractive alternative to a gas tax, which is well, it is still based on use, but as Shoshana talked about, as our cars become more fuel efficient, which is something we would like to see, a primary transportation revenue source is decreasing. So the road usage charge converts those fixed costs of vehicle ownership into really a use-based costs, and people pay more if they use the roads more and drive more. So it sends that price signal directly based on how much someone drives and can be incentivized to reduce driving. Road usage charges, or RUCs, can be designed to fluctuate based on demand or to just be a flat fee, that kind of true replacement for a gas tax, really just a use charge. Oregon is a pioneer in the road usage charge space, and we've had a RUC program, Origo, for several years now. It's been piloted, so not many users, but they we can provide, when we get to this stage, some good kind of reports on what they found through that pilot. Washington also has done a pilot program, WARUC, or the Washington Road Usage Charge. And in some research this morning, I saw that Utah, I think, is also on the road usage charge bandwagon. So more case studies to come there, but that is, I think, because of the technological lift, we put it more in that sort of longer term category, but we've got the head start with having the Origo system up and running. So, I'll take a breath. This was, as I mentioned, a big lightning round, really high level. We could spend hours on each of those, and we will, but we want to now kind of pause and really spend the last sort of 45 minutes of our time together hearing from you about what has kind of grabbed your attention as we did that teaser trailer for those typologies, what questions are coming up for you, and if there was a strategy you were maybe hoping we would have a chance to talk about and you didn't see on those slides, we'd love to talk about that as well. So I will pause and let folks weigh in with their hands, and we'll go from there.
We have Tony.
Great, Tony, kick us off.
Probably no big surprise here. I love parking-based strategies. And so first I wanted to, on the slide when we talked about what we could do with parking strategies, I noticed that there was the comment that significant technological investment might be needed to do more dynamic. And I just want to say that I think, that I was on that committee. We have a once-a-year strategy. I argued on the committee for a more regular strategy for updating pricing. I don't think that would require much investment of any kind, really. I mean, other than collecting data, which is important. But I think that one thing we should think about as a committee for that is, in my impression from years looking at this, there's a political impediment to some of these strategies. Current council, and that may change after the elections, but current council seemed to really always want, it seemed PBOT felt that we wouldn't be able to get things through city council unless they could weigh in on every adjustment themselves individually. And in several of the committees I've been on parking wise, one of the recommendations of the committee, or a general feeling, has been, let PBOT do their job, let PBOT adjust the rate of parking pricing to manage demand. And what usually ends up, but it's difficult. We have not yet been able to get council to pass something that removes the authority to actually set the price of parking unless it goes to a council vote. So I think that that's something, I think, you could just unlock the handcuffs on PBOT as far as managing this most valuable public asset that we own. And a lot of these things, things could happen much quicker and more dynamically and work. So I think that's the real struggle there. Finally, I think that there's a cordon pricing. It seems really cool. I just want to pitch that I think that there's a kind of a cordon pricing on the cheap that could be done, which would be a combination of some of the things we saw on the slide. A private commuter parking tax, ideally commuter, based on peak hour entry exit to all day parking. Actually doing dynamic and on-street and public asset parking more regularly, so better pricing on that. And then more TNC fleet surcharges. All three of those seem like, to me, that if they were implemented uniformly in the central city, that would be very similar to a cordon, in that almost anyone driving in would end up paying something. I guess if you just drove in and dropped someone off personally and left, you might not. But most of the traffic, I think, that comes in and out of the central city in peak time would be caught similar to a cordon, but with very little need for investment or privacy issues. And much of that money would be unencumbered, I think, by the constitutional limitations. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Tony. Mariana, can you tell us who's next on the hand-raising queue?
We have Monique, followed by Vivian and Sharifa.
Great, Monique.
Hello, everyone. Great thoughts from Tony about parking, to be expected. I also really liked the idea of unbundling parking from housing costs. And I think that would help us in the future. You know, we talked about historically how closely housing and transportation are linked. And also as we try to do things like incentivize private vehicle usage, I think having housing and transportation being unbundled opens up a lot of different tools and complementary systems. I was also super interested in understanding how the 50-cent surcharge got set. Like, was there an analysis around why 50 cents was added to every ride? And that seems like an interesting number to change, along with the delivery fee, which seems like it could be implemented in a way that's not as regressive as some of the other options at hand. So really excited for a lot of this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Monique. We definitely designed this. As I said, I'm not the expert. We're going to have experts come in. So there's going to be a lot of questions I think we get tonight that we're going to have to put on we'll answer when we get there. I do just want to pause if any of our strategy team members do have an answer on the TNC surcharge piece you'd like to offer now, or we can hold that for a later meeting.
Sure. Can you hear me? This is Noah.
Hi, Noah.
The surcharge on TNCs was set in place really without any connection to demand management. It was really set in place to fund a regulatory oversight program for enforcement of city code around TNC behavior, driver standards, data sharing. So we run that program, and as Emma stated earlier, a few related programs that support the conditions the council set forth for TNCs, such as engaging a driver's board and providing equal access to people with disabilities. So all of that, it was probably a spaghetti against the wall, to be honest, but it was a 50-cent fee set up to fund that, and not anything to do with demand management, which is different, I should point out, from taxi licensing, or what sometimes in New York is called medallions, where you're actually managing the supply of vehicles on the road. So you're not managing the demand for those vehicles, you're managing the supply of the vehicles in the market. So the TNCs really don't have either a supply or a demand control on them. It's just related to the regulation of the companies. So that's how that happened. That was about 5 years ago, and that's where we are today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Noah. Mariana, can you remind me who was next?
Yeah, absolutely. Vivian is next.
Great. Vivian.
Hey y'all, great comments from both Monique and from Tony thus far. Thanks so much for this flyby presentation. I know things went really quickly. A few things just came to mind for me. First of all, I learned a little bit more. Some of these tools I'm more familiar with than others, and I learned quite a bit. So thanks for pulling together this broad overview. Hopefully we all learned something from it. The two things that really struck me is, first of all, following from Tony's conversation, is there's some the information is presented currently in a really neutral fashion, and I think that as we dig into this more as a task force, I'd love for us to grapple with layers that are a little bit more challenging, such as the political layer, and knowing a little bit more around what the past thinking has been, what the current thinking is, because that's a variable that we have to deal with as we're making these recommendations. So, how can we have a very, very real conversation around political will and viability of whatever we come up with? I've been through too many processes in which that just seems like it's very neutral, and it's not. So let's grapple with that. The second piece is, what we haven't talked about in these, in all of these different strategies is, it'd be great if, as we dive in a little bit more, to understand what the equity implications have been in other places. I mean, none of these tools are necessarily completely new, and so we have some lessons to learn. They're not necessarily all applicable to Portland, because of course we recognize that Portland is the most unique place there is, but there are some things that we can possibly learn throughout the very long history of these different tools, what has been grappled with before. I can share some of the experience, for example, on value pricing, otherwise known as congestion pricing and tolling, because I sat on the ODOT committee a number of years ago, and so I think that should be brought up, because those equity considerations have not changed, and to that end, looking forward to also a deeper dive on the current mobility within equity communities in Portland, because that obviously has come up when we talk about, charging for parking downtown. What about low-wage workers there? That has an equity implication. So all these things are really interwoven, and I'm just looking forward to prompting a deeper dive, because of course this committee's charge is pricing for equitable mobility. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Vivian. Great comments and great things for us to follow up on and for future agendas. So I appreciate that. Mariana, who's next?
Sharifa is next.
Sharifa, we'd love to hear your comments.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
You can.
All right. When I hear, for all the different pricing strategies and stuff, I guess my first thinking is, well, how much is it? It's like, can we actually discuss actual prices? Because my income being fixed versus somebody else's not, it's gonna affect how that feels, and how equity-wise and how it hits the pocketbook. So I guess, and also I think with that, because when I took a class last fall, there was in LA, I guess, on some of the highways, they actually have private highways, like in between, like in the median strip between the two public highways, and it was built completely privately, and so it's tolled privately. And I was shocked to see that some of the prices were like $9 just to drive down that road. And of course that was or even more, I think, but of course that was at high congestion time or whatever. And so I guess and which just absolutely blows my mind. And I guess I'm curious, like, how much are we talking here? And also, how much does the system itself need to bring in order to cover the cost of the system? Is there, in London and Stockholm or whatever, all these places, how much of that revenue is going towards paying for the system itself? So, I guess those are the things I'm wondering if we're going to discuss, and if anybody has any knowledge on percentage for the second part of that question.
Those are excellent questions, and definitely things that we will put on the agenda, and also for exploration with our technical consultant on board to support us to kind of understand what we can learn from other places. I know one tricky thing when you're pricing for demand is it's not, that's what impacts the price value, but you're right that avoiding that really realistic question, the kind of reality of what this is actually going to mean, makes it hard then to understand those implications. So we will definitely explore that through our kind of how we're going to do our technical evaluative process and what we're going to discuss as a group. Other members of my strategy team, anything you want to add before moving on, other than that we're going to note that and come back to it?
Yeah, well, I guess just sort of in addition that, right, it's, across each strategy that we talked about, the answer would be different. And as Emma said, if part of the goal is managing demand, then, the price may be different at a time of high demand or in a location of high demand. But I think as we get into any particular strategy, one of the things that we do hope our consultant will help us be able to do is to say, you know, what would it have to be? So we will, you know, what is at least within a range of what is the highest level or something that it would have to be to have the impact that we want. And then I think to your point, we all need to grapple with, and then who is that going to impact? Will it, you know, will it impact people on fixed incomes? And if so, you know, how can we work, you know, how can we find a way to both manage for demand in a way that achieves some of the climate incomes and continue to make getting places accessible? So so it's all of the connected questions we'll have to ask for, I think, each one of those strategies that we look at.
And similarly, you know, one thing we will, on that slide that Shoshana had, that or Shoshana presented, that was the other side of the coin. So the things you could invest in, one of those buckets is rebates, exemptions, subsidies. This is something I think we will also want to explore and also lean on our consultant and examples from other places about, because there's a bit of a tension there. There's, you know, the more exemptions you give to a demand management strategy, the less impact that has on managing demand. But that said, that can be a big tool in the toolbox for making a system equitable and negating potential regressive impacts. So it's a tricky question, but an incredibly important one for us to explore going forward.
And I think maybe also just drawing on Vivian's point, that as we dive into these, you know, looking to what other places who have done some of these things have learned and what have been the equity impacts, whether they anticipated them or not. It's again something where we'll really want to hone in and try to learn as much as we can.
Sharif, anything else you want to add?
No, I do. Actually, I do. I do appreciate, like, you know, how TriMet has done where you can fill out the paperwork for getting reduced fare. I know at Portland Parks and Rec, you can get reduced fare at the community center. And I think there needs to be a consideration that this is it feels like a violation of privacy, and it is a violation of privacy to always, every time you turn around, tell everybody how much money you make, how poor you are, show them your little slip from Social Security Disability Administration. It's a bummer. It's not pleasant. So I do understand that you may consider it a tool, but for some of us, it's just a pain. That's all. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Mariana, who is next?
We have Aaron.
Aaron.
Okay, you hear me okay? I love the direction of this discussion. This is like, we're finally getting into like the meat of stuff, you know, which is, I think, what we've all been wanting to do. And Tony's comments, Vivian's comments, I think were spot on. I guess the thing that I was considering with all like hey, this is what other cities have done, these are what, you know, the possibility, like, just considering all the potential barriers and like incorporating what's the low-hanging fruit, the easiest things to implement, whether, like what Vivian said, political issues, or what Tony said, or if there are cost issues, or there are creative ways to get around it. I mean, I think that Tony's right. There are like some middle ground solutions that may not cost a ton of money to go full tech dynamic on-street parking, but yet we could still at least get a little bit better than where we currently are, without having it cost a ton of money to get there. And so I don't know, I guess I just I think that there's a lot of creative solutions that may not cost a lot of money, but for whatever reason, change in general can be hard. And how do we maybe help quantify, like, hey, this would have a huge impact, would be super expensive. This will have kind of an impact, but we could do that, you know, right now. And I guess that dynamic I really want to see as we kind of dive into these things, not just what could we do or how it would affect, but the actual practicality of implementing it, how quickly, how easily we could do that, or what are the barriers to that? What are the things that are the roadblocks that are keeping us from doing some of these bigger picture ideas?
Great, thank you. And related to Sharifa, your other point about looking at other cities, what's the true cost of implementation and the true cost of operating these kinds of systems? And so both the kind of practicality in terms of readiness to implement, ease of implementation, and also cost. Great points. Who's next, Mariana?
I was next.
Oh, welcome.
Hi. Okay, so hopefully I'm not going to repeat some of the other comments that folks have made, which have been really good feedback so far. But as Shoshana was talking about the various options, it just made me think that I don't think we've necessarily landed on what are the priorities. So are we talking about revenue? Is that the priority? Is it demand? Is it mobility? Is it reducing congestion? And so I think like we really need to tackle all of those various layers of what the priorities are and then weigh them against these various options. We have a better understanding of what are the implications of that. And then the other piece is what is the pricing? What will the pricing look like? What is the tipping point to get that behavior change that you want? Because I think some people will still pay an exorbitant amount to drive because that's what they will do. But that may not be feasible as a pricing strategy. And so if there's any research on that tipping point to get people to perhaps look at other options, I think that would be helpful to understand. And then let's not lose sight of the fact that with the pricing strategies, we still need to look at transit as a pricing strategy. We still need to be competitive price point wise, as well as efficiency wise in order for it to compete well among the various strategies.
Great comments, Hal. Thank you. And to that earlier point about priorities, I really appreciate that, and I want to mention that one thing we really took out of our last conversation, and we want to keep exploring as we go through, is we have a big framework with a lot of great indicators, which is so great that it really represents that when we say in the charge that our priority is advancing equitable mobility, that has a lot of different facets to it just there. So you have to kind of dig a layer deeper. And I think we started talking last month about how sometimes there's different priorities at different times or different priorities for different strategies. And I think that it's something we'll just want to keep exploring as we start to use the framework as a tool. But I really appreciate the question. And other strategy team members, anything you want to say in response to that point?
I think I'll just add it, right. I think by defining, in the charge, we talked both about climate, and that leads to some direct, direct reductions in BMT. But yes, defining the sort of other pieces of an equitable system very broadly, it leads to a lot of things. I do want to be really clear that even though in the presentation we talked about revenue, we don't. Revenue is a factor and transportation funding is challenging, but we do want to be clear, the charge here is not just to generate revenue. Like it's sort of, as we get into what would we do with the revenue, there are sort of some implications we have to just keep in mind a little bit, but it would be if we were to price just to raise revenue, it would drive us in a different direction. So that one is definitely not the main driving force. But then again, how we exactly settle on the most critical pieces of the equitable mobility framework, I think we'll have to continue to grapple with a little bit.
The only thing that I would add in addition to that is just it's been helpful to me to think about some of these things as dials instead of switches. So there's a question of how far you dial. So it's not an either or, it's how far you dial things. So keeping the price lower will often generate more revenue, but have less of an impact on demand, or ratcheting up the price will reduce demand. And where you want to be in that dial is depends on, you know, what balance of outcomes you want. So that's sometimes a helpful way for me to think about it, but it's a great question.
We're throwing gears at you today. We're throwing dials at you. So many metaphors. Thanks, Noah. I think, is Justin next, Mariana?
That's correct.
Great, Justin, welcome.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks. So I think this is related to maybe something that Vivian threw out and Andy's question as well, but I'm just curious, across kind of all of these case studies, which were the best at improving equitable mobility? And I guess simultaneously, what are kind of the pro tips of being politically successful to get it across the finish line?
Great questions. And yeah, I think we, in planning for this meeting, weren't sure kind of how far to go on case studies. And we decided to kind of save the case studies for when we can go deeper on them in those individual meetings. And I think that your points, Vivian points, and many others, you know, these are really helping us think about what we bring into those case studies and what we ask our consultants to help us share with you guys in terms of data. So excellent. And in terms of the political strategy piece, which I definitely hearing coming up. So thank you very much.
Well, can I just jump in?
Yeah.
I think the, you know, again, one of the things we'll have to grapple with is I don't know that there's a clear, you know, across different, there are the things like the cordons, which we have seen more implemented in other countries with very different political contexts. And also different definitions of equity or what they were looking for. So yeah, we will, across strategies, we'll try to look for the most applicable sort of case studies and see what we can learn about them. I think one of the reasons that we're doing this here is that our definition of equity is different than other places, and our politics are different. So we'll try to glean what we can from other places and know that we're, some of those questions we're learning as we go too. So yeah, I don't know that we can say these are the guys that did it the best.
Yeah, sure. Makes sense.
I believe Elizabeth is next. Is that right, Mariana?
That's right.
I'm learning to read the hands. It's great. Elizabeth, welcome. Oh, Elizabeth, if you are talking, we can't hear you.
All right, great. Sorry. Trying to manage a lot of different things right now.
The youngest task force member. That's great.
Here's Maggie. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of echo and acknowledge what some other folks have said. And, you know, I definitely hear you on not wanting the driving factor here to be revenue, but I also think that we should be explicit about what it takes to make pricing equitable, right? And that is frequently revenue that then can be flipped to, you know, subsidies or rebates or something like that. And so, you know, I back on one of the other slides, we sort of talked about the many purposes of pricing in the system, and it's covering costs of maintenance, capturing true costs, and affecting outcomes. And maybe that's baked into affecting outcomes. I was sort of thinking of affecting outcomes as like shifting people's behaviors because there's now a price there. But we may want to be explicit about, you know, we would envision that revenue from pricing would be used to then drive equitable solutions in sort of a progressive way. And I really want to also acknowledge Sharifa's point about paperwork, and like that's big, and I don't know how to solve that, and I don't know. I think that that's something that that this group should really look at, is what are best practices for sort of squaring that circle, because that is really significant, that this not be placing additional burden on certain communities. And then lastly, I think Stephanie and Hao sort of alluded to this, but just, you know, if if pricing goes up and vehicle miles traveled comes down, the question is like, what replaces that? And you know, is our transit system prepared for that? Is it adequate to that task? Is it running the right routes? Is it running at the right times for the people who will be maybe maybe want to take that option instead? And is it the right price? And so I know that a lot of that's been alluded to, but I think if I think about the cities that we've been talking about, or the cities I've lived in where I've driven less, they've all had more robust public transit systems than Portland. And so, so I think that needs to be an important part of the solution. And I know that, you know, TriMet is not City of Portland, but, you know, we have to find a way to sort of make those things work.
Thank you very much. All really great comments. And, you know, as Shoshana started the meeting off with, we hear you loud and clear on the transit piece. And you know, and I think that's very consistent with the research PBOD did prior to this work, when we in that first kind of phase of the congestion pricing study of what made pricing work in other cities, work in quotes, and what seems to be that key ingredient for pricing for equitable mobility and transit. Absolutely, that nexus is critical. Strategy team members, anything else you want to weigh in on there?
I just want to thank you for sort of mentioning the importance of Sharifa's point, and thank you, Sharifa, for bringing that up. And yes, we have to figure out how to not make this a burden, either financially or in any way. So absolutely, you know, not a burden, not things that people have to feel uncomfortable for. So yes, super important that we figure those pieces out too.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to say that I think we should look into linking income qualifications to other programs so that people don't have to apply and, you know, submit the amount of income that they have for each different program.
Thanks, Ingrid. That's great, and definitely part of kind of the how, you know, that if and how new strategies. I think these are exactly the types of recommendations and pieces of advice that we'll be looking to this group for. So thank you very much. I see Bao next on our hand raised list.
I do see Bao. I do want to acknowledge that I think there were other people who had their hands raised at some point that had lowered their hands. So I just want to invite them. If you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand again, and we got you on the list. So I just want to share that with folks. So yes, go ahead and move with Bao. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariana. Bao, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, great. First of all, congratulations to our newest task member, Maggie. This is lovely. Yeah, that's so awesome. Yeah, I think I love this, you know, how this conversation is going. A lot of great points. I want to echo the equity discussion we talked about earlier, the consideration by Vivian, and also Tony's points and Aaron's points on the, you know, how we prioritize, you know, the short term versus long term, or low hanging fruit, you know, or some more challenging policies in long term. I do want to emphasize one point is that we should also be very careful with the unintended consequence. So I remember there's an example when London, you know, implemented their pricing policy. I could be wrong, but I believe they exempt taxi from the pricing. And then, you know, there's our TNC came, they said, hey, we're a taxi. And then they had to, you know, immediately, or should be quickly adjust that to make sure, okay, well, you're the new taxi, but in our policy, we didn't treat you a taxi. So this kind of thing, we really be able to nimble, I mean, as Emma, Shoshana, you mentioned in the policy, that we can adjust. You know, ideally, we can adjust very frequently, often, you know, ideally real time, but we'll get there. One more point before I, you know, finish this is I noticed that under parking, the kind of types parking, talking about public and private, we do have another type of parking, if I may say, is park right. I believe the TriMet owns the park right, and sometimes a very strategic place. and there might be some opportunities we can leverage from there. So that's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Val. Those are great comments. And thanks for, please bring up those new things and things we haven't thought about, and Park and Rides is a great one. I do just also want to acknowledge, we've got Andy's hand up. Andy's going to go next, but Esme also made a great comment in the chat about, we're a little bit pioneering in this work in terms of centering this conversation on equitable mobility from the outset, which means, well, we'll glean as much as we can from other places. There's a lot that we're doing here that is new. And so she was asking if we can get a list or summary of the proposed equity metrics that we're going to be using through this work. Excellent point. That is one of the next steps for our equitable mobility framework. So, with your input and the indicators we've identified, we're now going to look to our kind of internal technical experts and our consultant team to help us start to pick out the exact metrics within those places. And we'll bring that back to you as that kind of working draft document that we work on together. So we will follow up in the future with more on those specific metrics and how we start to quantify, or where necessary, use qualitative data to flesh out what those indicators look like. Andy, I think you are the last hand up. And Andy, if you're still there and you're talking, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Two separate questions. First, I'd like to argue a little bit with Shoshana when you said this is all about managing demand, not about raising revenue. And if this effort is intended to have an interface with ODOT and the Rose Corridor project, that is about raising revenue. And so it's important for us to be clear. Are we pursuing a particular strategy to manage demand or raise revenue, and not let those get blurred? Or if it's both, be clear about what part of the strategy is the revenue raising part and which part is the demand management part. And if the objective is to raise revenue, then Sharifa's question is right on. How much does it take to hit that target? And is that tolerable? And if it's not tolerable, and we need to cut that rate in half, then how much of what we need to raise is being raised, and how much is not being raised, and who's picking up the rest of that tab? So the revenue piece of how we're looking at all of these things is an important one to not lose sight of. Second suggestion, independent of the first one, is the ODOT Origo project could be a vehicle, a platform upon which to implement a congestion zone. It's only possible for GPS-enabled vehicles, but you could set it up so that if they cross into a congestion zone, then the price per mile goes up. And if you exit out of the congestion area, the price per mile goes down. And if you're doing it at 8 o'clock in the morning, the price goes up a lot, versus if you're doing it at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe it doesn't go up at all because you're not in a congested period. So Origo is a platform that could implement that, and the current testing phase they're in could implement that as well on an opt-in basis. So I would look forward to those.
Thanks, Andy. You're such an overachiever. You jumped to like the last typology and are already giving us great things. So that's great. On that first piece around revenue strategy, team members, any follow-up comments you'd like to make?
Well, I guess I'll just say, you're right, of course, about ODOT. ODOT has two clear goals, and I think, again, we're trying to, we brought up revenue this time. Revenue is clearly a factor. I think to date, our goals, what City Council charged PBOT and BPS to look for is really to focus on using pricing for the managing demand piece. we again are participating in the ODOT process, and we hope to talk to you all more about how we should continue to show up there. But you know, we're driving towards the managing demand piece that is the sort of the first level thing we want to accomplish. But then have to think again about what does that mean when we show up in this other process where they have two very clear goals. And again, what does it mean? You know, we have to generate revenue just to pay for any system we set up, as people have talked about. There's all sorts of other needs. So I think everyone is just adding, again, sort of richness to this, that it's a very nuanced conversation, which we all need to understand. Again, I think we would end up with a different system or different types of pricing if revenue raising is our main goal. So unless, we can have a conversation about changing that entirely, but so far that hasn't been the primary goal here. But yeah, good points again. And Orgo as well, absolutely. We'll want to talk more about how that can be, how maybe there's a base layer that then becomes a vehicle for doing more of a congestion zone.
I think it's a good opportunity, just as a reminder for everybody, that our task force is to advise the city and city council and the PBOT director on the best way to show up, both in our own processes and in external ones. So I actually think, Andy, it's not inconsistent, because we, the city, have shown up as partners in the ODOT process with an emphasis on demand management as the key component, while recognizing it generates revenue and there's things they want to do with the revenue. So that's an opportunity. So it's just a reminder for everybody on the task force to say, oh, this is the city's what the city brings to these sometimes multi-agency efforts around pricing.
Great, thank you, Noah and Shoshana. I am not seeing any other hands raised. Mariana, do you?
No other hands have been raised so far.
Okay, so I'll kind of do the linger on this slide to just see if anyone else wants to put their hand up for a final word before we move on. Going once, going twice. Oh, there's a ding. Okay, well, great. Then we'll move on and really to our wrap up. So this was just an incredibly rich conversation. Once again, we are so appreciative of your, really, really thoughtful contributions to this. It's just a real pleasure to kind of be on the strategy team of a project, but where we actually look to our task force to help advise so much of the strategy. And we're really, really excited to be entering this new phase. So our next meeting, the intent is to do that deeper dive on parking. And we'll start kind of moving these strategies through a bit of that process that Shoshana mentioned, where kind of we start with some ideas, we start with our equitable mobility framework, we really grapple with them, we see kind of what we want to move forward for some deeper analysis and go from there. And we'll share a lot more about how the mechanics of that look in our next meeting. So in between now and then, to kind of prepare for that, there's a few things we want to mention. We will likely be sending some materials to read in advance, just so that we all kind of have that common grounding. We'll also do a presentation in the meeting, of course, but we can't all be Tony Jordan and know everything about parking. So look out for some pre-meeting materials. And again, we also really encourage you to share materials with us that you think that your fellow task force members would benefit from, and we can post those online, or to share other ideas that maybe pop into your mind after today's session that you'd like to see us capture in the work plan. We will follow up on a lot of the pieces, the questions that we got today, but also the pieces around kind of the next steps for our framework, for metrics, for how we're going to evaluate things. We're very excited to bring in our consultant more in the next phase. Not that you don't love hearing me talk all the time, but I will try to talk less in meetings and have other experts share more nuanced and rich information about this. So with that, I will, I guess, turn to Shoshana and Noah to see if you have any closing comments for us before we wrap up.
And I think you covered it. Just we appreciate everyone's feedback again. We've had such incredible discussions, and thank you, and look forward to seeing you again next week virtually.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and finishing early. It's a miracle.
Thank you.
Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Good job, you guys.
I'm hitting, I'm gonna stop recording right now.
Excellent. Thank you.